Today, we're digging into a story that really gets to the heart of our justice system. We're talking about a series of official grievances filed against a former New York judge and dozens of attorneys. And they raise some pretty profound questions about fairness and who holds the powerful accountable. And that right there is the central question being asked by a group of citizens who call themselves Waterman Watch. They've put together a mountain of documents alleging a pattern of really serious misconduct. So let's break down what these grievances actually claim, who's involved, and what this group is demanding.
So here's our game plan. We'll start by introducing the key players. Then we'll examine the specific allegations. After that, we're going to do a deep dive into something called the contempt playbook. We'll also look at the web of connections between the people involved. And finally, we'll cover the call for accountability.
All right, let's set the stage. The person at the center of all this is Kathleen Waterman Marshall, a former matrimonial judge in New York. And the complaints against her? They're coming from Waterman Watch, which is a group made up of people who had cases in her courtroom and are now alleging some serious, coordinated misconduct. And it's really important to get this straight from the jump. This is not just one person with a grudge. Waterman Watch has filed detailed grievances against the judge and nearly 30 attorneys who they claim were all acting together. They're painting a picture of a systemic issue, not just a few isolated incidents. And when you look at the complaints, they detail a whole spectrum of alleged wrongdoing. It's not about just one thing. They're describing a pattern of behavior that, according to them, consistently put one side in the courtroom at a major disadvantage. The allegations laid out are, well, they're extensive. It starts with claims of favoritism, leaning towards wealthier clients and the big law firms. But it goes way deeper than that. We're talking about denying basic due process, displaying a hostile temperament, and holding private off-the-record communications. The grievances even point to instances of illegally closing the courtroom to the public and racial insensitivity. Now, to back up these claims, one of the complaints presents this just stunning piece of data. After looking at nearly 450 of the judge's rulings, it alleges that she ruled against the spouse with less money a staggering 91% of the time. The grievance basically argues that a number like that isn't a coincidence. It's evidence of a deep and consistent bias. But of all the claims, the grievance document points to one thing as the most extreme misconduct possible in New York State. And this is the alleged pattern of wrongful contempt proceedings that in some cases actually led to people without lawyers being thrown in jail. So first, a quick primer. Contempt of court is a really serious charge. It means you disobeyed a court order, and the punishment can include actual jail time. Now, because it's so severe, New York law is crystal clear. If you are facing contempt and you can't afford a lawyer, you have a constitutional right for one to be provided for you. And that right is right at the center of these allegations. The documents allege this wasn't random, but a kind of repeatable four-step playbook. Here's how it supposedly worked. First, the lawyers for the wealthy spouse would file a contempt motion. Second, the judge and those same lawyers would allegedly just move forward without ever telling the unrepresented person about their right to a lawyer. Third, that person is found in contempt. And finally, in several documented cases, they were sentenced to time at Rikers Island. And to prove this, the grievance includes direct quotes from official court transcripts. In one case, a litigant tries to say for the record that he doesn't have a lawyer. The judge, according to this transcript, just immediately cuts him off, telling him, "You be quiet now." And the pattern allegedly just continued. In another case they documented, when a person facing contempt asked for a public defender, the judge's response was a direct and legally incorrect no. The complaint makes a point of noting that the opposing lawyers who were present just stood there and said nothing. The grievance argues this wasn't just a one-time mistake or a bad day. It claims that across 9 different contempt cases over a 3-year period, there wasn't a single time that the unrepresented parties were properly informed of their right to a lawyer. The result, they claim, was a complete and total breakdown of due process. But, the grievances don't just stop with the judge. They also name almost 30 attorneys from some pretty prominent law firms, alleging that they were complicit. And this leads to the next major claim, this whole web of connections that raises some really serious questions about impartiality. So here's just a sample of the individuals and firms that are named in the main grievance. And as you can see, it's a list that includes lawyers from some of New York City's really well-known matrimonial law practices. The core of the complaint against them is that these attorneys knew the law, they knew these unrepresented people had a right to counsel, but they just stayed silent. And the grievances go even further, pointing out what they see as major conflicts of interest. For example, they say that several of the lawyers named in the complaint later went on to co-sign articles publicly defending the judge. They also highlight what they call a Cardozo connection, pointing out that in 7 of the 9 wrongful contempt cases they documented, the attorneys for the powerful spouse were alumni of the very same law school as Judge Waterman. Okay, so after laying out this incredibly detailed pattern of allegations, the grievances wrap up with a really direct and urgent call to action aimed right at the state's attorney disciplinary committees. So what do they want? Well, their primary demand is pretty clear, and it's twofold. First, they want an immediate, temporary suspension of the law licenses for all the attorneys named. They say this is to prevent what they call irreparable but avoidable harm. And second, they are demanding a swift and thorough investigation into everyone's conduct, both the attorneys and the judge. And this quote, which is pulled right from the grievance itself, really captures their sense of urgency. They're essentially saying, hey, we tried to warn the oversight bodies before, and the failure to act has already let more people get hurt. They believe the evidence they've laid out is more than enough to justify taking immediate protective action. Now look, it's absolutely crucial to remember that the allegations raised by Waterman Watch are just that. They are allegations. They have not been proven in any formal proceeding. But what they do is force us to confront a really critical question about our legal system. When regular citizens believe that judges and officers of the court are failing to uphold the law, that path to accountability can feel really difficult, almost impossible, leaving all of us to wonder, who is watching the watchers?